Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Feel Fisher Silicon Valley webinar of 2019. You're joining us today from a rather rainy California, and we're hosting from our new offices. Over the last few months, we've focused on discrete points under GDPR, but we're kicking off the new year with the EU Network and Information Security Directive, or NIS. So, as you might know, NIS entered into force in August 2016. And member states had until the 9th of May 2018 to implement it into national law. But of course, at that time, NIS was in the shadows of GDPR and probably not considered by those organisations that it impacts. So that's those providing critical infrastructure and digital service providers. But we're here today to run through its scope, obligations, and what that means in practice. So a few quick introductions. I'm Megan Ward. I'm a trainee solicitor in the privacy team out here in Silicon Valley. And today I'm joined by our panelists, Mark Webber, who's our US managing partner and heads up the team out here. Next up, we'll have Paul Lamois, who is a director in the SVO. And Paul will be joining us shortly. Just caught in the traffic to the office, but he'll be here with us soon. And we're also lucky today to be joined by one of our colleagues on the other side of the pond, Michael Brown. And Michael's a senior associate in the UK privacy team, and he's based in Scotland. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, just a few housekeeping points. The webinar will be recorded, and so we can circulate the recording and the slides after the session. And listeners are on mute, but any questions that you have, please feel free to send them over with the chat function. And if we don't get a chance to cover them in the next 30 to 45 minutes, we'll be able to circulate the responses along with the slides after. So as a bit of background, NIS is the first EU-wide cyber law and emerged as a result of the growth in number and scale of cybersecurity attacks. The aim was to reduce the threat of cross-border cybersecurity incidents. So if we think of the likes of the WannaCry ransomware attack, which affected 150 nations, and also to protect critical infrastructure and the internal market. And finally, the aim was to address fragmented approaches across the member states. And as I briefly mentioned before, the timeline of all this, NIS is now in effect, and the national laws applied as of the 10th of May 2018. So, for example, the UK NIS regulations 2018. And so in addition to deciding whether you're in scope, you'll also need to consider which national law applies to your organisation. And we'll link to it later on, but the European Commission has an online map showing the transposition status per member states, which is very handy. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to run through the key pillars.
So thanks very much, Megan, and good morning to everybody. Just wanted to present the larger picture to NIS. So as Megan was saying, it's about coordination, and to some extent it's about the EU reacting to the changing cybersecurity landscape. It's about the EU ensuring there are sufficient protective measures in place by organisations which are caught, and as Megan said, in particular those involved in critical infrastructure provision or to digital service providers. But it also implements a number of procedures across the EU in order to deal collectively and respond to incidents. And there's a little bit of a big picture which is less relevant to the enterprise working out, so what does NIS mean to me? But it also is something we thought we'd bring out because it is relevant to the context of NIS itself. So on this slide, we summarise the 5 key pillars, and the real key to all of NIS is that if I'm aware, I share, and if I share, others benefit from my awareness. And in order to ensure that happens consistently across the EU, demanded a national strategy so that each member state would adopt a strategy on security for information systems. It mandated a cooperation group, effectively a group coordinated between member states relating to the exchange of information across borders. Linked to that cooperation group, another pillar of security incident response, so effectively creating computer security incident response team networks, or CSIRTs, which are national organisations tasked with promoting cooperation across the EU. And also information sharing, and then certain national designations in the fourth pillar, whereby member states and national competent authorities become points of contact for the individual CSIRTs, which are established around the EU. And then linked to all of that, and we'll come on to talk about that, there's also notification requirements and security standards and notification standards and registration requirements to ensure that enterprises that are caught by the NIS rules are registering with their local regulator, but then also aware of notification, but then sharing information locally at a member state level, and then within the organisation set up within the EU, those national CSIRTs and networks which are notified about incidents or problems are therefore cooperating at an EU supra level to ensure that there's a level of information sharing which is for the good of all within the EU, and ensures a sort of level playing field and effective sharing across the EU should incidents become notified. And of course, we may touch on the impact of Brexit and where the UK sits if we fall outside of that. But as a directive, it's been passed. In the UK, we've implemented national legislation, and for now, that national legislation is very much binding, whether you're regulated in the UK or elsewhere within the European Union. But that hopefully gives you a little bit idea of the big picture and the way information sharing is governed across those 5 key pillars. It's the usual aspiration of Europe, but it hopefully gives you some context into why NIS was created in the first place.
Thanks, Mark. So just welcome to Paul. He's joined us after the traffic problems. But so on to Mike, we're going to look at the scope of NIS.
Great, thanks Megan, and good morning everyone. So network and information systems is defined broadly under the directive and essentially consists of 3 limbs. So the first limb is an electronic communications network, and that term comes from a definition under a separate piece of EU law entitled the Common Regulatory Framework for Electronic Communications Networks and Services. Under that law, electronic communications network means, and I paraphrase, transmission systems, switching or routing equipment, satellite networks, fixed and mobile terrestrial networks, and electricity cable systems. So expect at least servers, cabling, routing equipment to fall within the scope of that limb of the definition of NIS. Second limb is any device or group of interconnected or related devices, one or more of which, pursuant to a program, perform automatic processing of digital data. So yeah, extremely wide, and encompasses any computer system such as desktops, laptops, other devices. On the third limb, it's digital data stored, processed, retrieved or transmitted by elements covered under points A and B, so that's electronic communications network and any device or related device, for the purposes of their operation, use, protection and maintenance. So that limb makes clear that the actual data stored on such networks or devices falls within scope. And in contrast to data protection law, the key point here is that both personal data and non-personal data are caught within the definition of digital data. So to break down that definition and put it into kind of slightly more practical terms, if you have electronic communications networks, they're considered NIS. If you have devices processing digital data, they're considered NIS. And finally, if you have digital data on electronic communications networks or devices, then that's also considered to be NIS. And just a final point on scope, the breadth does seem to be intentional from EU legislators to ensure that there are legal protections right along the chain, so that certain networks, devices or data aren't out of scope and thus potentially expose some security weaknesses. So I think next up is which entities are caught by the NIS directive. So NIS applies to two groups of organisations: operators of essential services and digital service providers. Operators of essential services are organisations that operate services deemed critical to the economy and wider society. And the slide sets out in blue the sectors which will include operators of essential services. So they encompass digital infrastructure, energy, healthcare, drinking water supply and distribution, transport, banking and financial market, and digital infrastructures. And the logic here is that, as Megan and Mark alluded to, if there's an attack on networks and systems in, say, Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris or the UK National Health Service, it could have a severely detrimental economic and societal impact more broadly across the EU. I won't dwell too long on operators of essential services since the focus of today's webinar is on digital service providers, but just so that you're aware, there's a two-limb test for being categorized as an operator of essential service. So first, you need to be operating in the sectors which I mentioned and which are highlighted in blue in the slide. And secondly, you have to satisfy certain threshold criteria outlined in your local European law. The criteria tends to be pretty specific. So it includes numbers of customers being serviced. If you're operating in the energy sector, it might, or the oil sector, it might include the volume of barrels of oil being produced. So it's quite prescriptive. And then as a separate point, separate regulators are in charge of regulating the behaviour of operators of essential services across the different sectors. So yeah, there'll be sector-specific regulators for each area. So as I say, focus today is on digital service providers, so I won't dwell any further. But do bear in mind that some of your customers might be categorized as operators of essential services, and so seek to flow down some of their key requirements under the law, but we'll come to how you might want to think about that slightly later on in the presentation.
Thank you, Michael. So Paul, a bit more on digital service providers and the definition.
Thanks, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Before I talk about digital service providers, I wanted to take one step back as well, because here in relation to the NIS directive, as the name suggests, it's a directive, and this means that each member state has has to implement the NIS requirements into the national law. And this means that there have been certain countries which have slightly deviated a bit from, for example, what constitutes an operator of essential services. And in France, for example, beyond the list that Michael just provided earlier, the French authorities, they've added other types of categories of what they consider to be operators of essential services. And you have, for example, insurance providers who are on the list. You have companies which provide mass catering services, servicing the healthcare sector, children, or prisons. You have wholesale distributors of pharmaceutical products. You have educational organizations in charge of national examinations. You even have social organizations in charge of the calculation or payment of welfare benefits. And the reason why I wanted to mention this and to stress on this is the fact that it's really important to look at the national law implementing the NIS directive, because the requirements may not necessarily be the same throughout the European Union. And so now going back to the digital service providers, so alongside the operators of essential services, you have the digital service providers who are required to comply with the requirements of the NIS directive. You have three different types of digital service providers under NIS. The first one is the online marketplace, and the directive defines an online marketplace as a digital service that allows consumers and/or traders to conclude online sales of service contracts with traders either on the online marketplace website or on a trader's website that uses computing services provided by the online marketplace. And basically this means that whenever you have a platform which allows buyers and sellers to conclude online sales, whether it's for the contract for the sale of goods or service contracts, and the final destination for the conclusion of those contracts is that platform, then such platform would qualify as an online marketplace. And as a result, it means that whenever you have an online service which is serving only as an intermediary to third-party services, where the contract will be concluded. For example, if we have a price comparison website, then that would likely be out of scope of NIS. And likewise, if you have an online service which is simply catering to putting in touch buyers and sellers, for example, an online platform providing classified ads, for example, well, that is likely to be out of scope of NIS as well. On the other hand, if you have an application store which enables the digital distribution of applications or software programs from third parties, then that is likely to qualify as an online marketplace according to NIS. Now, the second category of digital service providers would be the online search engine. And I'm sure we all know what an online search engine is, and the NIS directive defines what it is. It's a digital service that allows users to perform searches of websites in a particular language on the basis of a query on any subject in the form of a keyword, a phrase, or other inputs, and returns links in which information related to the requested content can be found. If you have a website which offers a search function, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would fall within the scope of an online search engine, because your search function will be limited to the content of your website, regardless of whether the search function is provided by an external search engine. And in addition, if you have an online service that compares the price of specific products or services from different vendors, well, this is not likely to fall within the scope of the directive as well. The third category would be cloud computing services, and that is defined as a digital service that enables access to a scalable and elastic pool of shareable computing resources. So you have lots of technical terms here, and I think it's important to go through them as well. So the term scalable refers to a computing resource that is flexibly allocated by the cloud service provider, regardless of the geographical location of the resources, in order to handle fluctuations in demand. You have the term elastic pool, which is used to define computing resources that are provisioned and released according to demand in order to rapidly increase or decrease resources available depending on the workload. You have the term shareable, which is used to describe computing resources that are provided to multiple users who share a common access to the service, but where the processing is carried out separately for each user, even though the service is provided from the same electronic equipment. And the NIS directive doesn't really go into specific detail as to what really qualifies as a provider of cloud computing services, or even online marketplaces. But then the legislative intent suggests that the categories should be interpreted relatively broadly. And this means, for example, that when you are dealing with cloud services, including infrastructure as a service, in other words, when the delivery of hardware or computing infrastructure is involved, or if the cloud services include platform as a service, so when you are providing developers with an environment on which they can build their applications to be delivered over the internet, or if you are providing software as a service, provided, of course, that the resources available to the customer are changeable in an elastic and scalable way, then for all of those, then it's likely that they will need to comply with the requirements of the directive. And again, going back to the point that I made earlier about carefully looking at the requirements of your own national law. In France, the law implementing NIS only applies to digital service providers with at least 50 employees and an annual turnover of more than 10 million euros.
Thank you, Paul.
So Michael here, just a very brief supplementary point to what Paul mentioned. So in kind of discussions we're having with clients at the moment, in terms of assessing whether they're caught by the definition of a cloud computing service provider, I mean, a lot of the discussions kind of focused on going into the detail of those 4 elements, but some of the discussion as well is also looking at how our marketing teams actually kind of selling the services and the products. So if there's kind of language around a digital service being kind of cloud focused or being scalable, elastic, so terminology reflected in the NIS directive, then it's worth considering, do you have kind of reasonable grounds to explain to a regulator and also to your customers that service isn't caught? So yeah, just one kind of practical point worth briefly bearing in mind, that your assessment as to whether you're caught should also kind of align with some of the kind of marketing communications you're making to customers. So hand back over to you, Megan.
Thank you. Yeah, so we had a look at which organisations are going to be in scope, and so Mark, if you are caught by by NIS, then what are the requirements on you as a digital service provider?
Sure, thank you, Megan. So as we've seen, even establishing whether you're a digital service provider is probably the most important sort of element of interpretation, and where if you're going to look at NIS and its potential application to you, you need to focus in. The real good news in some ways is once you establish whether or not NIS is applying to your business as a result of the services you're offering, there are really 2 broad obligations you need to be considering. Well, 3 if you include notification. The first one is around risk management, and essentially NIS requires systems to have sufficient security to prevent any action that compromises either the data that they store or the related services that they provide. And of course, if we're talking about cyber, we're talking about essential services or digital service providers, the overall intent is that the data on those services and systems is protected, and that the services that they provide remain up and protected. And in many ways, we then start to hear echoes of GDPR, because there's a general obligation to maintain appropriate and proportionate technical and organisational measures in order to ensure that risk is managed and that there is sufficient security. And those measures must reflect state of the art and take into account the security of systems and facilities, and that may be sort of deliverables like having antivirus or malware protection, potentially data loss prevention and endpoint encryption in place, as well as protecting the network and perimeter of the network. It may take into account incident handling, so incident handling and processes that have been tested, data breach policies, secure incident handling governance structures, and the fact maybe you've gained out and done a tabletop exercise to understand how you would deal with an incident should it be caught by NIS. It may also include business continuity management, so effectively having effective backup processes, disaster recovery plans, potentially down to specific recovery plans per office, per system, or per region, depending on what's appropriate given the level of data and the level of IT architecture. You may also, in order to ensure appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational measures, be considering monitoring, auditing, and testing. So that usual scheduling of audits, access logging and monitoring via a SOC or an SIEM, privilege access management procedures, joiners, movers and leavers, so a JML process, anything that protects and monitors who's accessing the system, what they're doing on that system, and how you may keep them out or prevent access to certain elements of the system. And then finally, NIS requires you to consider compliance with international standards, and that may include ISO 27001, other cyber essentials like SOC or NIST type policies, But all of that really comes into appropriate and proportional TOMs, so technical and organizational measures, but then reflecting state of the art. And it says it may take into account. So you need to be taking assessment of state of the art, what others in the industry are doing, what other functionality and proportionate measures may be put in place for an organization of your nature with systems that you're running and protecting data and processing in context. So there's a real overlap here with GDPR and some of the things that we were all planning together in the build up to May of last year. And you also then need to be thinking, well, I have obligations in relation to personal data under GDPR, but I also have risk management obligations in relation to data and not only personal data and under NIS, because it may be that there's a breach or incident relating to non-personal data. Now that would still be caught by the NIS obligations. And essentially this is about incident prevention, which is the other inset within the slide that I'm talking to. So essentially looking for steps to prevent and minimize the impact of incidents. And that's similar to the risk management we're looking at, but prevention, handling, response, testing, and documenting. Overall, I think it would be fair to say there's an expectation that there should be an information security policy and specific organizational policies around risk, around data security, HR management, the joiners, movers, and leavers, things that I mentioned, potentially encryption, potentially other standards, and other considerations to protect the operational as well as the physical environment that's protecting the data and systems. So an overall look at the technical and organizational measures or TOMs that you have in place in relation to the systems to give you an idea of the kind of security that's in place. And we can see from our UK regulator ICO, there are checklists in place here, but this is where, as a lawyer, you'll have some ideas, you may be able to guide, but you may be relying on other security professionals, consultants, and others that understand security at a more granular level and what is appropriate given the nature of data and the services that you're handling. And that needs to be considered in some detail in order to make sure that the technical organizational measures are correct and in place, but then importantly to ensure that they're reviewed along the way. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what NIS is requiring. Essentially risk management and prevention, but then also incident prevention. And we'll also talk about some of the notification. But why don't we talk a little bit, Megan, about incident notification requirements and what that might involve and where they may be similar to the GDPR and personal data notification obligations.
Yeah, sure. So again, we're going to focus on the requirements for DSPs. So digital service providers are required to notify the competent authority or CISA of any incident that has a substantial impact on the provision of their services in the EU. And that's taking into account a number of factors which the national implementing laws go into a bit more detail. So the EU implementing regulation goes into a bit more detail. So we've got the number of users affected by the incident, duration of the incident, so from disruption to recovery, the geographical spread, so has there been any cross-border impact, and the extent of the disruption of the functioning of the service. And so that takes into account availability, authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality of data or the service. And then finally, the extent of the impact on economic and societal activities. So that could be either material or non-material loss to health or safety or damage to property. And the implementing regulation also sets out some parameters, helpfully, where you could consider an incident as having a substantial impact. So, for example, services provided by a DSP, if they're unavailable for more than 5 million user hours, that's referring to the number of users affected in the EU, for a duration of 60 minutes, then that would meet the substantial impact threshold. And there's a few others that are also set out in that implementing regulation. And as Mark says, these obligations are in addition to the breach notification obligations under GDPR. So in this incident may, but will not necessarily impact, meet the thresholds as under GDPR. And I understand that the NIS reporting tool has a section where you can indicate whether personal data has been infected or not, but the notification obligations are in addition to those under the GDPR. So Paul, a bit more on what the requirements are of the what an organisation would be required to include in that notification.
Thank you, Megan. So under the NIS directive, there is a requirement to notify the relevant competent authorities or the National Computer Service Incident Response Teams whenever there is an incident. And incident is defined very broadly as well, right? Because it's any event having an actual adverse effect on the security of network and information systems. In the UK, digital service providers have to notify the ICO of any incident without undue delay and no later than 72 hours of becoming aware of it. So this, broadly aligns with the requirements of for the notification to the regulator under the GDPR, of course. In France, the notification should be made without delay after becoming aware of them, but there is no specific time limit. So, again, it really depends, on the requirements set out in the national law. So, what information do you need to provide in the notification? This is up to each country to implement it into the national law. Typically, you wouldn't have to include things like the name, the time of the incident. So it's advisable to look at the national regulator's template for the breach reporting. And there may of course be some specific situations where the digital service provider is acting on behalf of an operator of essential services, and in that case it's there is no requirement under the law as to whether the digital service provider needs to be the one doing the notification or not. And in that case, it's advisable to check the contractual terms to see if there is anything which is expressly laid out in the contract. And in relation to who should notify if a digital service provider is acting on behalf of another digital service provider, and that situation is also a bit unclear. I guess it will be necessary to wait and see for guidance from regulators or maybe even enforcement actions to see what is the required position on that. Who should notify the affected individuals? Well, under the NIS directive, there is no specific requirement which is imposed upon the digital service providers. It is likely to be the regulator who will notify the public after consultation with the interested parties, including the digital service provider. But then, again, here we're talking about notification under the NIS directive. It has nothing to do with a data, personal data breach as defined under the GDPR, which lays out its own specific notification requirements.
Thanks, Paul. So we've had a brief overview of the obligations, but in practice, I know we've touched on it a bit about the overlap with the GDPR, but what are the key considerations that an organisation needs to think about in terms of the impact of the directive and the national laws?
Thank you, Megan. I would say that even if you are not based in the European Union, well, you should still care about the NIS directive, because there are situations where the directive could impact digital service providers which are based outside of the European Union. The directive requires that even if you are not established in the European Union, but if you are offering services within the European Union, in that case, you would be within the scope of the directive, and you would be required to designate a representative based within the European Union to act on behalf of the organization under a written mandate. And some of you may think, well, this sounds a lot like the GDPR. What is providing services within the European Union. And if we look at the recitals of the directive, the criteria also look very similar to the GDPR, because it refers for example to factors such as the use of a language, use of a currency which is generally used in the European Union, mentioning of customers or users who are in the EU, and all of those criteria make it apparent that the digital service provider is offering services within the European Union, and therefore this triggers the application of the directive. As to who should be appointed as a representative, well, there is not much information given in the directive. In the directive, they mention that the representative should be acting on behalf of the digital service provider. It mentions that the national authorities should be able to contact the representative if ever they need to. And of course, since we're talking about a representative, well, it means that you have to choose carefully who you appoint as your representative, because at the end of the day, they would be your contact, the contact point between you and the European authorities if anything goes wrong. In relation to enforcement, the NIS directive mentions that the competent authorities should take action, when necessary, through supervisory actions after the fact, ex post supervisory activities. Whenever they are provided with evidence that a digital service provider does not meet the requirements regarding security or incident notifications. In relation to the NIS directives penalties, this is always the penalties was always a hot topic. People want to know, well, how is it going to be enforced in practice? What does it mean in terms of sanctions? Well, the NIS directive doesn't expressly lay out the penalties. Instead, it simply mentions that it's up to the EU member states to set up the rules regarding the penalties. It simply mentions that the penalties must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. And it leaves up to the member state to decide, what are the financial amounts which may be imposed for non-compliance. And this means that you have a wide variety of potential sanctions. For example, in the UK, the maximum fine can be 17 million pounds. In Spain, the maximum fine can be 1 million euros. Whereas, for example, in France, the maximum fine can be 125,000 euros. So as you can see, there is a large discrepancy across the different EU member states. Finally, in interaction with the GDPR, throughout the presentation, there was a mention, about GDPR, and what is important to remember is that the GDPR is actually, an entirely different piece of legislation. So it coexists with NIS, but it doesn't replace it, and nor does the GDPR replace NIS. And that is because the two laws, they actually cover two different things. The NIS directive concerns computer systems, the digital data stored and processed within such systems, whereas the GDPR is focused on the processing of personal data. And this means that if you are within the scope of NIS, but if you are also a data controller or a data processor as per the GDPR, then in addition to the requirements of the NIS directive, well, you would have to comply with the requirements of GDPR as well. And in practice, this means that the NIS incident may be the initial intrusion into the computer system, what disrupts your service. But then what would trigger the application of the GDPR would be what comes afterwards, the personal data breach, which follows the intrusion. And because we're talking about two different stages of the same incident, it means that it may be necessary to notify two different regulators about the same incident, and it also means that it is possible to be subject to regulatory action and even fines under both pieces of legislation.
Thank you, Paul. So, as you said, thinking about both pieces of legislation and the extent of the incident and the data impacted by it. So finally, if we've got I think we've got a couple of we've got a couple of minutes left. So Michael, just in terms of next steps, what do organisations need to consider?
Yeah, so I think a preliminary measure before working through next steps is to self-assess whether you're caught as a digital service provider. So it's not a requirement under the law, but it'd be prudent to enshrine your assessment in writing. And equally, if you're taking the position that you're not caught, it'd also probably be sensible to record this in some form of written assessment as well. And then on the basis that you are subject to the law, first step would be to consider your applicable law and jurisdiction. And as kind of Paul and Mark and yourself, Megan, have alluded to, so the NIS directive states that a digital service provider must comply with the implementing law and jurisdiction of the EU member state in which it has its main establishment. So main establishment should be read as being the EU member state where you have your head office, the digital service concerned. If you're not established in Europe, and many attendees in the call might be working for organisations who aren't, then you're required to choose the jurisdiction on the basis that you do offer digital services in that jurisdiction. Factors to consider in terms of selecting jurisdiction would be the requirements of the local law, and as Paul's alluded to, there's some divergence in local laws around some of the obligations as well as the enforcement measures, so worth scrutinising those. Another consideration would be the approach of the regulatory authority in the jurisdictions, and then obviously there's kind of broader geopolitical factors like Brexit to bear in mind. The next measure would be to register with your competent authority if that's a requirement under your applicable law. For instance, it's an obligation in the UK, and worth noting that the deadline for registration in the UK was the 1st of November 2018, and so any kind of subsequent registration should be dealt with sooner rather than later. It's a relatively straightforward process to register in the UK and is probably the same in most other jurisdictions, so involves sending an email or making a call to the authority with some general information, and for the time being there's no applicable fee. Cancering through the next steps, subsequent measures to take is to appoint a representative. If you're not established in the EU, it should be a company rather than individual. So for example, the role isn't analogous to a data protection officer. It should be weighed by way of a written mandate, and so a letter from a parent company to the representative company documenting the appointment should suffice. Thereafter, you should review and refresh your security measures, and the European Commission's implementing regulation of the NIS directive sets out some useful suggested measures which cover the various areas. We've actually prepared a checklist with these, so feel free to drop us an email after the webinar, and I'm happy to share that. Bear in mind that competent authorities in some jurisdictions have the right to request documentation around compliance, and so the absence of any NIS relevant standards in your policies and procedures are unlikely to be viewed favourably by the authority. How are we doing? We've got 1 minute. I'll split this up into 30 seconds each. Develop an effective cyber incident and response plan. I suspect by now most organisations will have refreshed their plans for GDPR compliance, but as we've touched upon earlier, there's separate notification requirements under NIS, and so timelines are slightly different, data and scope slightly different. So one of the real concrete action items from the law is to ensure that your plan covers incidents which might be in scope of NIS as well. Final next step is to prepare for NIS-related negotiations. So take a look at your standard terms to check whether NIS is covered in terms of security requirements and instant notification flow down. For instance, we're still seeing some definitions for applicable law and contracts as simply the GDPR and e-privacy directive, rather than specific references to NIS or indeed kind of catch-all wording which would encompass NIS. And yeah, as a kind of concluding note, we're definitely kind of post GDPR now seeing a bit more of an uptick in terms of questions and knowledge of NIS. So expect that to kind of continue as the law continues to bed in. So back over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think we've got 1 minute left. So if there's anything, Mark or Paul, you'd like to add, or?
No, I think we should just, dwell on Michael's comment that and our comments at the beginning that this is often forgotten, particularly with the hurly-burly of preparing for GDPR. Now's a good time to take a step back and work out whether NIS is applying and to start thinking about some of those changes. It isn't particularly detailed in terms of the consequences of being in or out of scope, but obviously, as we were talking about particularly the definitions of digital service providers, the sort of real difficulty in the analysis comes to working out whether or not you're fitting within that criteria of a DSP, digital service provider, and just assessing your service against that. And if you can overcome that hurdle, you should quite quickly be able to work out whether the NIS is going to be applicable to you, and then would need to move to the appropriate regime depending on your lead authority and where your main operations are in Europe to work out how and what you need to do in order to comply. And yeah, that's the sort of the essence of a number of the discussions we've been having with clients in the past couple of months. I'd probably just a time to say we're going to close, and I'll hand over to you, Megan, just to sort of wrap up. So.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much to Mark, Paul, and Michael for being our panelists today, and thank you all for listening in. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, wherever you may be. And as we mentioned earlier, any questions we haven't covered, we'll answer in our follow-up materials. And just a quick heads up that the next session we're hoping to host on Wednesday, the 13th of February, I believe, and it'll be on marketing and lead generation. But we'll send an invite for that shortly. So thank you very much.